Hello and welcome to another episode of flower breeding. In this episode we'll talk about the history of dahlia breeding. The earliest known example of a dahlia was in the late 1500s, plausibly 1880 or 1885. The plant was illustrated by Francisco Hernandez, the physician of Spain's Philip II. This king sent Hernandez to Mexico in 1570 in search of natural riches, and then sent a report back to him. After leaving Spain, Hernandez was neglected, likely due to rumors of his possible Jewish ancestor somewhere in his family line. He gave back the report. 5 years later, after he finished his work, he was sent back to Spain, and the papers were put into a corner and neglected, and only part of his work was published after his death, with most of the originals burnt in the Great Fire of Esquel in 1671. 1 century later, in 1651, the Italian scholar Vitalis Mascardi found the first example of a double-flowered dahlia, but breeding of the dahlias did not come into vogue until the end of the 18th century. This was through Abbot Calvenis, director of the Royal Gardens of Madrid, in 1789. The primordial dahlias used for breeding were Dahlia pinnata and Dahlia coccinea. Several attempts to propagate it later led to the eventual breeding of dahlias. The individuals that popularized the dahlia, however, were Napoleon Bonaparte and the physician Alexander von Humboldt. Although neither individual met eye to eye so much, due to Dr. Humboldt being physically much taller than Napoleon, and Napoleon being paranoid about his wife possibly sleeping with Mr. Humboldt. But on a side note, putting politics aside, through the breeding of both Dahlia pinnata and Dahlia coccinea, the former being the ancestor of the single petal flowers, and Dahlia pinnata being the ancestor of the many different variants that have multiple petals. Much of the variation in color and shape was already developed just through the obtainment of different seeds and seed stock. As they reached Germany, there were over 50 varieties of dahlia, both single and double flowered. These varieties were bred extensively with each other to breed new varieties, and here are some of the different breeders that tinkered with these varieties. The first being Christoph Friedrich Otto. He was the gardener of a fellow named Mr. Willdenow. Mr. Willdenow had Mr. Otto begin his work in crossbreeding different varieties of dahlia, during which time Mr. Otto sent seed to London, where the seeds failed to germinate, as well as other parts of Germany. Using the seed, another generation was bred in the Leipzig court. From these varieties, over 100 varieties were bred. After Willdenow died in 1812, Otto became his sole heir. Now on to another breeder, Christine Degen. He bred a few varieties of dahlia, one of which was most popular was called Kaiser Wilhelm, an orange ball type. In total, he bred 20 fully double varieties, and was also the first one to breed dahlias with a sturdier stem. He then took on another gardener as a partner, Johann Stickmin, and through the tutelage of Mr. Degen, Mr. Stickmin managed to breed his own varieties as well, including the deep red Alexander von Humboldt. Now on to the next flower breeder. The most prolific breeder of dahlias in Germany was Wilhelm Pfister. He started his nursery in 1844 in Stuttgart. His father was a harness maker, and he inherited that land from him, breeding Poinsettiums, Dahlias, and Gladiolus. He built his reputation on these three species and the varieties he bred, but his dahlia varieties were amongst the best varieties in Germany at that time. In the end, however, he was born in 1821 and died in 1905, and his descendants continued to run his firm. But due to World War I and World War II, the shifting from breeding of flora to warmer climate regions due to cheaper wages and ever greater competition with international companies, the company shuttered in the 1980s. In total, the firm, however, produced several hundred varieties, just using Dahlia pinnata and Dahlia coccinea. Later on, Dahlia juarezii and the cactus types were introduced, and this was prior to the appearance of the cactus type dahlias and Dahlia juarezii appearing on the market. In later years, the nursery bred cactus type dahlias. and by 1911, only dahlias listed in the nursery were derived from cactus-type varieties, as the older varieties disappeared from popularity over time. Now on to the English breeders of dahlia. Due to the Industrial Revolution, English breeders were able to amass a considerable amount of money, and so a great many dahlia breeders were of this stock. We also are of John Keynes. John Keynes, the grandfather of John Maynard Keynes, the famous or infamous economist, was an avid breeder of dahlias in the county of Salisbury, Wiltshire. Near the end of his life, due to his popularity, he became the mayor of that city, and the business was sold after his death. This left John Neville Keynes with a very handsome amount of money, allowing for a comparatively easy life during the Great Depression. But John Keynes I introduced dozens of cultivars of dahlia. His varieties were bred by Grandpa Keynes himself in 1833, and went on until the end of the century, long past the date of Mr. Keynes' death. As such, it was likely that after the death of Mr. Keynes, it's likely that the firm hired a professional hybridizer. Mr. Keynes was known as a shrewd businessman, only selling the most fashionable and popular plants at that time. As such, he was good at following the trends. Now on to our last two breeders. Samuel Whittle was born in Grantchester, a village near Cambridge. He bred dahlias by the dozen, had a son, who then retired and spent the last 40 years of his life doing nothing much of interest. And our last breeder of interest was James Levesque. He had a nursery in Pinestone Street in Sheffield, and was said to be the first person to produce a bicolored dahlia type. He also bred the first Sheffield variety of dahlia called Levesque's Incomparable. This cultivar won 12 prizes. The beauty in Sheffield is said to be the first double-colored variety of dahlia. The illustration on screen is actually of this cultivar. In later parts of his life, Mr. Levesque was working on a new law of some political members. Sheffield, like Birmingham, was a very large and wealthy manufacturing city, but had no representation in Parliament. Eventually, the 1832 Reform Bill he co-wrote was passed, which remedied this situation. That about covers everything. Thank you for watching.